Your brain was never designed to process 10,000 data points before breakfast. Before you've even opened your eyes this morning, your mind has already been asked to hold a headline about a war on the other side of the planet. A text from someone who's upset with you, a notification that your bank balance dropped, a stranger's opinion on a video you posted, and the quiet, nagging sense that you're behind on something you can't quite name. This isn't tiredness. This is bankruptcy. A slow, silent draining of your cognitive reserves. The same reserves your ancestors used to track a single predator, or grow a single field, or raise a single family in a single village for an entire lifetime. Today, we are not going to talk about productivity hacks. We are not going to talk about digital detoxes that last a weekend and change nothing. We are going to talk about something older and considerably more dangerous to the algorithms that profit from your attention. We are going to build the Stoic shield. 2,000 years ago, a Roman emperor named Marcus Aurelius woke up before dawn and wrote himself a private note. It wasn't for an audience. It wasn't for legacy. It was a warning aimed at himself. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. He wrote this not to become bitter, but to inoculate himself, to make peace with friction before the friction arrived, so that none of it could catch him off guard and drain him dry before noon. Now, consider what Marcus never had to face. He never had a phone that buzzed 40 times before lunch. He never scrolled past 3 global catastrophes, a friend's engagement announcement, and an advertisement for shoes, all within the same 11 seconds. He never had an inbox that refilled itself the moment he emptied it. We are living through a permanent state of decision fatigue that no civilization before us has ever had to survive. And the mechanism is simple, even if it doesn't feel simple. Every algorithm you interact with today was engineered by rooms full of extremely intelligent people whose entire job is to make the scroll infinite and your attention finite. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Your brain has a biological stopping cue built in, a signal that says this task is complete, you may rest now. A book ends, a meal ends, a conversation ends. But an infinite scroll has no stopping cue at all. There is no bottom of the feed, there is no final headline, which means the only thing that can stop the drain is you. And most people never learn to be the one who stops it. Instead, they experience what we'll call the leaky bucket phenomenon, a slow, invisible leak where 100 micro-distractions, none of them individually significant, quietly drain the same well of focus and creative potential you were supposed to draw from for the deep work of your actual life. You don't notice a bucket going from full to empty in one dramatic moment. You notice it 3 weeks later when you sit down to do something that matters and find there's simply nothing left in the tank. This is the crisis. Not one big threat, but 10,000 small ones, arriving quietly enough that you never got to declare war on any of them. So what did the Stoics actually do about it? Not meditate it away, not ignore it. They built a doctrine. There is a concept at the very core of Stoic philosophy called the dichotomy of control. It sounds academic. It is not. It might be the single most practical piece of psychological technology ever developed, and almost nobody uses it correctly. The idea is brutally simple. Some things are within your control: your judgments, your effort, your responses, your values. Everything else, other people's opinions, the outcome of an election, whether a stranger on the internet is having a bad day and decides to take it out on you, is not. And the Stoics argue that peace of mind is available to exactly one type of person: the person who has stopped spending energy on the second category. We're going to call this the doctrine of selective apathy. And I want to be precise about what that word means here, because it is not the apathy of a person who has given up. It's the apathy of a person who has decided, with full clarity, which battles are actually worth their blood. Think about the difference between a soldier who fights every skirmish that crosses his path and a general who chooses his battles. The soldier is exhausted by dusk. The general still has an army by winter. Right now, your mind is the soldier. Every day it fights skirmishes it never needed to enter. A stranger's opinion in a comment section, a 24-hour news cycle engineered to make you feel that the sky is always somehow falling, an argument you're replaying in your head from 3 days ago that the other person has already forgotten. The Stoics called the internal, your own mind, your own choices, the only territory truly worth defending. Everything external, they treat it as weather. You don't get angry at rain. You don't take it personally when the sky decides to storm. You simply put on a coat or you don't go outside. That's it. That's the whole technique. This is where we introduce a second tool, strategic indifference. Not indifference to people, indifference to noise. The strategic mind asks, before it engages with anything, does this deserve a place inside my head rent-free? And if the answer is no, it practices something almost nobody in the modern world has been taught. The art of letting go of a digital controversy that will have precisely zero impact on your physical, actual, real life by tomorrow morning. You are allowed to close the tab. You are allowed to mute the conversation. You are allowed to let an argument be won by someone else, on the internet, forever, and lose absolutely nothing of value in doing so. This isn't weakness. This is the first wall of the shield. Once you understand what deserves your attention and what doesn't, the next question becomes architectural. How do you actually build a life that protects this decision hour after hour, day after day? Because willpower alone will not save you. Willpower is a muscle, and muscles fatigue. What doesn't fatigue is architecture. The first piece of architecture is something we'll call the pre-mortem. Before a battle, a Stoic general didn't hope for the best. He imagined in vivid detail everything that could go wrong. And by imagining it in advance, he stripped it of its power to shock him later. You can do the same thing with your morning. Before you open your phone, before the day's noise arrives, ask yourself, what is likely to try to hijack my attention today? And have I decided in advance how I will respond? This single habit, deciding your response before the provocation arrives, is the difference between a mind that reacts and a mind that rules. The second piece is environmental. You cannot rely on discipline in a room engineered against you. This means designing both your physical and digital environment to enforce a boundary between information and insight. Information is raw material, headlines, notifications, other people's takes. Insight is what you produce when you actually sit with a problem long enough to understand it. Most modern environments are flooded with the former and starved of the latter. The Stoic shield requires you to physically limit the raw material so there's room left for the processing. The third piece is what we'll call the view from above, a technique the Stoics used almost like a mental telescope. Marcus Aurelius would imagine himself rising above the earth, watching armies march and cities rise and fall, watching the entire span of human history compress into a single blinking moment. From that height, the argument you had this morning, the notification that ruined your afternoon, the opinion of someone you'll never meet again, all of it shrinks to the size it actually is, which is small, almost always remarkably small. This is not about not caring, it's about caring correctly. Reserving your emotional and cognitive capital for the handful of things in your life that will still matter in 5 years, and refusing to spend it on the 1,000 things that were engineered to feel urgent for exactly as long as it takes you to click. Here is where most people, upon hearing all of this, ask the same fair question. Doesn't this turn me into someone cold? Someone who stops caring about the suffering in the world? This is the empathy trap, and it deserves a careful answer. There is a meaningful difference between productive compassion and the emotional exhaustion caused by what we might call global tragedy voyeurism. Endlessly consuming footage of suffering you have no actual capacity to affect, absorbing it as if witnessing it were itself a form of help. It isn't. Watching a tragedy on a screen for the 40th time today does not reduce that tragedy by a single unit. It only reduces you. The Stoics had a concept for this too, called the circles of concern. Picture concentric rings at the very center. Yourself, your own conduct, your own family. The next ring out, your community, the people whose lives you can actually touch with your actions. Further out still, your country, the world, the abstract mass of humanity you will never personally meet. The doctrine is not to stop caring about the outer rings. It's to recognize that your actual leverage, your actual ability to do good, is concentrated almost entirely in the inner ones. And so wisdom means directing the majority of your finite energy toward the circle where you have the most agency. This also means learning something most people were never taught: how to say no to low-value emotional demands without sacrificing your core humanity or your actual relationships. You can decline to argue with a stranger and still be a deeply kind person. You can mute a feat of catastrophe and still donate, vote, show up for your neighbor, raise your children well. Compassion that bankrupts you is not virtue. It's just a different kind of leak in the bucket. We arrive now at the final wall of the shield, and it is perhaps the most countercultural idea in this entire philosophy. Boredom is not a problem to be solved. Boredom, reframed correctly, is a high-performance recovery state for a mind that has been running at full processing load all day. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of you responsible for planning, judgment, long-term thinking, does not recover during stimulation. It recovers during stillness. Every time you fill a spare 30 seconds with your phone, you are denying that part of your brain the exact recovery window it needs to keep functioning at full strength tomorrow. The Stoics practiced something we might call meditative emotional regulation, the deliberate act of sitting with a small daily friction, a minor irritation, a moment of quiet discomfort, and processing it fully before it has the chance to compound into something larger and more chronic. Most people never process anything. They simply distract themselves past it, and the unprocessed friction doesn't disappear. It accumulates silently until it resurfaces as anxiety with no apparent source. And finally, the discipline recommends something almost forgotten in a world of infinite scroll: a sunset ritual, a short, consistent moment, however brief, where you audit your own mental expenditure from the day. What drained you that didn't need to? What deserved more of your attention than it received? What can you release before sleep so it doesn't compound into tomorrow's fatigue? This single habit, repeated nightly, is how a temporary tactic becomes a permanent architecture. It's how you go from occasionally remembering to defend your mind to simply being someone whose mind is, by default, defended. Imagine moving through the loudest room in the world and hearing nothing but your own thoughts. While most people are drowning in sensory overload, a disciplined few are quietly using frameworks that are over 2,000 years old to build something the modern world forgot how to build: an unshakable mind. You don't need to disappear from the world to protect your mental energy. You need a shield, and now you know how to forge one. If this gave your mind a moment of quiet tonight, stay a little longer. The midnight station has more waiting for you. Best wishes, Nightbird.